Good morning, friends. This morning, we have a continuation of the fascinating journey through life from our friend Jenny Smith. Today, we are to be told of working alongside the NCCL with the traveller communities in the UK. So, Jenny, when you are ready.
Can I point out that we have had traveller communities in Bristol for hundreds of years, and many of them were working on farms. They are the ones that lost their jobs to immigrants coming in from Europe who accepted rubbish wages, and the whole economy fell to pieces because of that. Somebody ought to have thought, we've already got people working in farms, rotating around the country to do potato digging, to help with the harvest, to do collecting for wines down in Kent. It was a very broad industry. And I also did tell you about Councillor Peter Begley and the Connor family in St. George back in the 60s, when Mr. Connor tried to settle down with his children, wanted them educated. A piece of land that had been used by a local family every time the Kennet and Avon flooded into their bungalow, and they moved up the hill into a caravan, and they fenced off that bit of land. Mr. Connors bought it, was thinking, good, I can settle down with my children and get them educated and sort things out. And immediately there was a massive hoo-ha, and they were evicted off land which they owned in the end. So it was lost. I also learned over the years, Peter was a member of the Roman Catholic Church, and I found out by default that the Catholic Church in St. George and the one in Knoll West were carrying out the marriages and christenings. And just through my attending various events, so I knew there was a structure hidden in Bristol to actually help gypsies and travellers. Before I really got involved in them, I'd actually been attending the Bristol courts and listening to criminal cases, so that I started to pick up a bit of what I needed to know, because housing walks so close to crime. It really does. And through that, I got some expertise and learned how I should behave if I was a Mackenzie friend, if ever I was helping anyone. On the 13th of January, and I'm not sure about this date because I know I did it, I don't know quite when, but the diary says this is when it was, 1980. And so this was just as I was leaving my training course and going to work for Shelter. And I attended a meeting in the House of Commons, which was interesting because I don't know who put me forward, but somebody had put my name there. And there were leaders of the travelling community in the UK, people like Hughie Smith. There was also Rodney Bickerstaff of what was Unison in those days, not was it? Anyway, it's one of the trade unions that changed their name. It will come back in a minute, I know it will. And Anne Badgett from Save the Children Fund. And it was held in the House of Commons in one of their committee rooms, and the room was full. And it was people from all over the country who had contact with travellers and who knew travellers. And I felt very much of a novice. So I was learning and listening. And how they'd found me, I do not know. So that was pre me going to work for Shelter. And I started work for Shelter in July 1981. I started to have cases, mostly people with roofs over their heads, but occasionally people that were homeless and squatters, people that had fallen through the system. But in February 1982, I was asked out to a holiday site at Avonmouth. And it was a bare bit of land, and it was February, winter. And on it was an elderly lady in a caravan, all by herself, in mud. It had got a few tracks around, and there was a tap for water, but it had been used for holidaymakers. And she was a traveller with a van, elderly, disabled, beginning to get dementia, and absolutely alone. There was a nice lady that lived by that did go and do her shopping for her. And she'd been on the waiting list for South Gloucester since the previous year, trying to get some form of roof over her head to get her out of there. During the winter and high tides, the sea was coming over the sea defences there, and the water was coming up onto the floorboards in her caravan and going out twice a day. I fought like mad to get South Gloucester to take her. It was like trying to pull teeth. It didn't work. And I was very much of a novice. I didn't understand some of the legislation. I mean, I now know about the 1968 Caravan Site Act and how that got changed and all the rest of it. And I can tell you about the Criminal Justice Act, but I couldn't then. But eventually, having caused a lot of fuss, she disappeared. And I never knew where she went. I was really worried about that. I hope South Gloucester took her, but to this day, I'm not sure. I did actually, while I have got numerous training I did through Shelter. I was going through a massive curve of learning about legislation, about housing, and about all sorts of other things. And I did do a caravan sites course in London, but that was only for mobile home sites and people that had security on a piece of land. So I wasn't really feeling I had any expertise in the field that I was being dragged into. I then, in the 1980s, founded the Avon Travellers Support Group. And we met in pubs. We met in any committee room we could cadge. And we did it by telephone so that no one knew we were doing it. And we were all in that room. Many of us had very little knowledge about gypsies and travellers, but were trying to find out what was going on. And I remained on that until I became a county councillor in 1985. I was learning. There were people in that room that did have more knowledge than me. And I went down onto a traveller's site on the cut by where the railway goes over. And it was a disused bit of land that went back. And what had happened there was a traveller boy had had a car accident or an accident. He was on life support in Southmead Hospital. And because of that, we've managed to prevent eviction, and we're holding it so that family could go and be at his bedside while he was dying. The moment the life support came off, the bailiffs were there. And I always remember one of the bailiffs saying to me, "You're a do-gooder." And I said to him, "I suppose you're a do-badder then." And he didn't like it. And I also remember the Alsatian dog that tried to eat half my coat. I wasn't having that. And, you know, it was just, we cared a bit. There were these people that were going through life's hell, which happens to people, and they weren't getting any support from anywhere. Also, we learned about a Mrs. Black that had come over from America, and she lived down in South Somerset. And she was a lay preacher for one of the fundamentalist churches in America and had come to the UK. But she was wandering around gypsy sites and traveling sites all by herself, not being very effective, but actually writing research and logging what was really going on those sites. And we met up with her again. I'm saying we, and I'm trying to think who was with me. I was not alone. There was someone with me that day. But the ring road used to have a lot of land on it that travellers used to get onto before they now built all these houses that they recently put up on it. So that the travellers were pulling in there, and we went down for an eviction there as well. So this amateur was turning up occasionally, but not really in depth or knowledgeable about what was going on. I also, at about the same time, helped at Glastonbury on a shelter stall. And while there, I started to talk to the New Age travellers who had burnt out buses and vans, and some had odd caravans, and learnt about them. And I'll tell you that I ended up liking Hawkwind there, because at night there were 3 different bands illegally playing all night, and I had to decide which one I was going to go to sleep with. It was a bit of a, but I was learning that there were other groups of travellers around that weren't just the Irish, they weren't just the Romanists, there were other itinerant groups that were there. During the, yes, I've done the 1980s support group. Anyway, we moved on with the support group until I became a county councillor. And I don't know how, but I must have convinced Avon County Council Labour Group that it was an issue and an important issue. Graham will probably tell me how I affected his wife's thinking. And as Avon covered a wide area of local authorities, Bath, North East Somerset, South Gloucester, and North Gloucester and South Gloucester, it was quite a large area, each local authority with their own policies. And by having a county council, there was, for the very first time, the ability to get people to start talking to each other. Not that the local authorities seemed to want to do that. And the leader for South Gloucester was Pat Hockey. Pat and I eventually ended up working alongside each other. And for the first time, Avon County Council, in fact, any authority had ever produced a policy document on gypsies and travellers. And the most important thing we felt was that we had sites in each of the local authority areas for them to stop on, for them to get water, to have sanitation, to have skips, and most of all, healthcare. The other thing I found out from gypsies and travellers is that when babies died, sometimes if it's in the middle of an eviction, they had no choice but to bury them along the side of the road. So the babies didn't even have a proper grave. They moved on. And when you know that the Irish travellers have the same blood group as I do, we lose a lot of babies. I'm an O rhesus negative, and O rhesus negatives don't seem to be able to hold on to babies all the time. They wanted health care. The children wanted health care, but so did the parents and the men. Oh, and I'll give you a tip. If you go into a traveller's site, be a woman, go straight to the women. If you're a man, you're going to have some hassle. And it was almost like being a woman was an advantage. I didn't realize it until I saw what happened to a man one day and thought, it wasn't perfect. Used to get a lot of banter, but they soon learnt who I was. Now, the Environment Agency was in charge of all traveller legislation throughout the country. And I went there and just took notes while an interview went on. And I'm trying to think of the officer, the person that was in charge of that department, and the politician. And I know that I took notes of what everything went on, hardly spoken a word in that meeting, and came back and wrote the press release on the way back on the train, which really upset them because they didn't think anyone was really going to do that. But it was chipping away at what was going on. We also felt that the children's education was failing. We managed to work not only with ourselves, not with just Avon, but other authorities in the country were listening. I went up to Sheffield once or twice over the time I worked with travellers, but the first time I went there to talk to them about education. And we decided that if the children had a slip of paper that said where they had got in the curriculum, then the next time they went to another site to stay, they could pick up on their education. It wasn't easy what we were doing. And I think that Pat Hockey ought to have a medal for standing by, because she brought not all, but enough of the Liberal Democrat vote into the room to support us getting documentation and start putting the roots down to have policies and procedures. We also, when children were being born, we were trying to get at the health service to hold on and help us hold on to them, so that if there was complications with the birth, they actually did end up in hospital, have it being delivered to babies. I always felt I was an amateur. I never felt I was very good at it. But it began to work because some people other than me were taking notice. You know, there was a man called Phil somebody who was a newspaper reporter. He came and went and you never knew who he was, but he was doing articles. He was writing about it. And it was part of what was going on in the community that really most people didn't ever know even existed. The Avon Travellers Support Group was taken over when I became a county councillor by Ron Stainer. Ron had a piece of land out on the edge of the city. It is an old quarry. He tried for planning permission for God knows what, failed, and then suddenly heard about us and thought, lovely place to give it gypsies, get them. Old Puckle Church was where it was. So he came into our meetings of the Avon Travellers Support Group. Goodness knows how he found us. But he eventually took over, and he was an absolute thorn in the side of Avon and everybody else for the rest of the time. He was going to get not only travellers' sites, but travellers' site for himself as well. And he became an authority on it. I've told you about going for the women on site. Oh, yes, I was also a member of the Council for Civil Liberties, National NCCL it was in those days, which is now called Liberty. And I attended their meetings in Bristol, but that became quite useful because I then started to become an observer on things that were going on, like evictions, but also on the group Reclaim the Streets in Bristol, some of whom were actually New Age travellers, and I knew it. And I think you all know that some of them that we've got in Bristol are tied up with the BAM people that are there, but they're also tied up with the squatting movement. So I got to know who they were. And just as an aside, I was the observer on the M32 when they blocked it coming into Bristol. The blocking by the Green Group was nothing new, really. Somebody had already done it back in history. And a woman started to break her waters in the middle of it. And because they had my phone number and I had the police phone number, so that I could communicate, get her out as fast as possible into an ambulance and get into the maternity to have a baby. And there was also the flyover by Templemead Station that used to exist in the old days. And they blocked that as well. And I walked through all the police with big shields and everything, and told the police that the women and children who were being kettled at the time were getting very restless. The children wanted food and they'd like to come out, please, if you would let them go. So I was moving in on the edge of our society, the bits of society that aren't official, don't exist, but do because they happen. As I said to you, the new travellers tie up with the squatting movement in Bristol. And you learn who people are. I'm not very good at names, which is an advantage sometimes, because if the police actually said, who have you just spoken to? I was thinking, I don't really know, but I do because I've seen them for years. So I'm not a very good witness. I've always been bad on the names. I cannot ever explain why. But I found out that some of the New Age travellers have actually been the squatters up in London, in Paddington area, where there were major court cases went through against Rackman landlords. And when eventually the landlords, I don't know whether they successfully sued them, but certainly the properties were all taken back. They had the choice of being out on the streets or in vehicles. And a lot of the so-called New Age travellers had come out of situations like that. In other words, they've been in squatting, they've lost their squat, and they bought an old ropey vehicle and went onto the road. And I suppose they thought coming to the southwest was like coming to heaven, which it turned out eventually not to be. But that was the other thing. I knew some of the background of the traveller community. I sat down at campfires and talked to them, found out what was going on, learned an awful lot about motors and engines that didn't work or were clobbered together that really shouldn't be working, but did, and did the best I could. As an Avon County Councillor, we actually did identify at least 2 sites. We worked very hard to get the site that's out at Avonmouth, which worries me even to this day because it hardly ever has travellers staying on it. It's supposed to be a transit site and it isn't. We got the permission for the site down in Bedminster, but that was already a traveller's site. It was just the travellers were going down in numbers, and it was taken over, and it's now an official site there. Oh, and the fairground people. There's a ex-fairground people if you go up towards Hartcliffe out of Bedminster on the right-hand side. That was there before we started. And what happened was eventually they got too old to go back on the road. So it turned into a caravan site, not for travellers, but for fairground people that have got, you know, out of time, life had got out of hand. They owned the land. And I occasionally, even now, find bits out about them, and I gather they're very independent and very much in control of their bit of land. There was also fairground people down in the middle of, just off Old Market, off of Middle Road. And there was a small bit of land sandwiched between the church and the Old Market shops, right in the back of it. And it wasn't very big, but somehow or other, they managed to, every winter to fold up a whole fairground and put in there, and still live in their caravans on it. But they must have had some of the equipment over the top of their roofs and God knows what. And I never understood how they did that. But eventually that was taken away from them as well, which was sad because that had gone on for over 100 years. But this is what was happening. The world was modernizing. The world hadn't got time for people that didn't have roots. And being a nomad left them hanging in limbo often. I sort of got travellers coming into the office asking for help, but I did do some roaming around to see what was going on sites. And that's when I started to get Bristol solicitors involved in cases. And they fought them. We held them for a while, but we never actually really won any ground, other than the fact that we did get one or two going into council housing around the city. Then Shelter, I don't know how Shelter did this, but somehow or other, they were asked if they had anybody that knew anything about gypsies and travellers. And they said, yes, Jenny. So Shelter went for a grant from the European government for me to assist with leaflets, reports, factual evidence about the effects that biased legislation was having on the gypsy and traveller groups. And this really was a double-edged sword in a way. Right. As I said, Pat Harkey and I were getting on quite well, and we still were. But this was towards the end of Avon County Council being in situ, so that things were changing about support for some of our so-called radical ideas. We'd argued so much to get humane and policies and plans into being, and some of them were happening. But then when they went out to some of the authorities, and North Somerset were about the worst, it just didn't happen. I suppose they just throw the paper in a bin. We also on Avon County Council employed a health visitor. She was specifically paid to go from site to site to site within the Avon area to give health advice to get the women a doctor, to get the children assessed to make sure that they were healthy. And she was a wonderful woman. She actually emigrated to Australia in the end because the whole thing was falling to pieces. And with her conscience, she didn't want to actually stay around to see what was the future was. I was actually outed, by the way. They were going, I was on public platforms, and so was Pat. We rotated around Avon, actually putting the case for logical conclusions, pointing out that it would eventually stop hassle for them as well as the travellers if we actually achieved some more permanent sites and got them into the structure of normal, and to allow them to still wander off to whatever festivals they have in other parts of the country. One night I was in the kitchen, the phone went, and it was Ron Stainer saying, Jenny, they've just given your name and address out at a public meeting and told the people in the meeting to come and get you. So I wandered out to my husband that was doing woodwork in the garage, told him what had happened. He said, oh, well, just shows what sort of people we have in Bristol. And he went on doing his woodwork, and I went back to doing what I was doing in the kitchen. They didn't come, but it was the atmosphere that was coming quite fast. People didn't, I suppose people like to have people they look down on so that they can feel slightly superior. But we're all God's children. We're all part of the community in our own way, sometimes very embedded into it and sometimes on the edges. And a bit of respect for each other, I think, is lost sometimes. I started to go from site to site to site throughout Avon. I know that one day I was trying to find a site and couldn't, and went to a site near Radstock, and they put a guy in the car with me to show me where the people I wanted to catch up on were. And I heard them say, and you are not to touch her, you are to look after her. And he was getting a hell of a time for the whole of the site. And I think he must have had a really bad criminal background somewhere, but they were protecting me as well, which was nice. I visited Ireland. I went to Galway. I've got family over there anyway. I'm quarter Irish, and found out what they were doing and what their services were like. I also travelled right across the country. I went to South Wales site, which the boxer came from. There's a famous boxer came out of that site. I went up into the Welsh mountains and found that the gypsies there spoke Welsh. They didn't speak English, which I thought was fascinating. And they said that their ancestors had been there. They could speak a bit of English because they could talk to me. They'd been there for hundreds of years. I went up on the north of England and found that travellers there were blue-eyed, blonde hair, were absolutely adamant that they were descendants of Boadicea's army. And I thought, well, now we're digging up bodies that look like that's part of her army. Perhaps we can do some DNA tests and see if they're telling the truth. I went to Sheffield and found John Major, who was a prime minister. He was, wasn't he? Yeah. Anyway, he's descended very closely from gypsies and travellers. And so was Maggie Thatcher, her father. People don't know this, But at least some of them had chosen not to be on the road and got away. What they did afterwards, some of us would definitely disagree with. I went up to above Edinburgh to a traveller's site, and I went to Glasgow. One of the sites that I visited there was by the sea, and the tide came in twice a day and cleaned all the rubbish out and took it out to sea. And I thought, well, so much for environmental pollution. That went down the drain. But I started to get to know the leaders of travellers, and some were nice, some really cared about their people, and others were exploiting them. But then we get that with house dwellers, don't we, as well? I was out on a New Age traveller site in Swindon in Wiltshire, and they suddenly all, a group of them disappeared and came back, and they just raided, I think it was Asda's bins, and came back with stale bread and everything else to eat. So they were surviving on the real edges of communities. By the way, I'm distantly related through marriage to landowners in Berkshire, the Lydiards, and you can't get higher than the Lydiards in Berkshire. They didn't think what I was doing was very nice. Auntie Phil felt I'd gone absolutely mad. But then they were protecting their own vested interests, weren't they? And I was trying to calm things down and get realism to walk in the door. A farmer in Berkshire with a brand new baby on site sprayed cow manure all over the land surrounding all their vehicles. It was like there weren't any rules. You can do whatever you liked for travellers. And some of them, yeah, you've got to be careful. I went in on the site that is still there. It's the other side of Southmead as you get the other side of the old airport. There is a traveller's site there. And I was taking the women on site to see, I think it was Brian Cox, one of the Bristol solicitors, because they were trying to shut down that site, which had been there for quite, I think it was before the war or just after the war, it was formed there. And Mrs. Holland got into the car, my car, and then started collecting everything in the car and putting it into the cubby holes and the locker. And she said, the traveller woman was about to arrive, she's got sticky fingers and she'd steal these. And I thought that was nice in a way. Travellers protecting me, stopping bad things happening. I did go up to Hyde Park Corner, by the way. Oh, but Brian Cox was very active on. So was Richard Nile. Richard Nile complained because at Westerly, there was a traveller's site there that I took them on. I also took Anne Badgett on that site. They were being threatened by farmers that they were going to come in and beat them all up at 6 o'clock in the morning. So she and I got up and went at 6 o'clock in the morning to be there, and they never arrived. But she said you could see the poverty on the site of the children and the fact that they really didn't have much property of any sort, not realistically. I also took, and I've digressed a bit, but I took Anne Badgett onto the sites in Bath. They were a bit of land between the railway, main railway to London and the canal. It was slope. They had benders in there with children. Gypsy Lee was there with her children. And as Anne said, and it was bitter winter, raining, freezing cold. They hadn't got shoes on their feet, and you could see the mottle of their skins where they were freezing cold. And I took her around site after site after site in the Avon area and showed her the conditions that some of the families were living in. If your miracle fell to pieces, they ended up trying to survive in woods in Somerset or somewhere else. It's not romantic. It never has been. You can see I was getting angry and I knew it. Oh, by the way, when I went to Hyde Park, on the way up, the police had stopped a New Age traveller van and were asking questions. So I pulled in behind it and walked up to them to find out what was going on. And suddenly all the police disappeared. And many years later at a Labour Party conference, I sat next to a policeman plain clothes, and he said, I'll go and check what they say about you. So I told him my address. 3 years later, I met him again. I said, and he'd left the police force by then, he joined the Labour Party. Well, we're sending them to Labour meetings. And I said, you didn't do it? He said, no, I couldn't. He said, I've never seen a thing like yours. He said, I had to have a pass number to get into it. And I hadn't got it, so I couldn't make it. He said, what on earth have you done? And I thought, interesting. But they just let the van go. The van was going up to join at Hyde Park. They were attending the event that I was going to. And when I got up there, I did a speech and started to tell everybody about the fact that travellers had no rights whatsoever. That we really needed legislation. I keep trying to think who it was. There was I was a Liberty Observer at Stonehenge. I got to know some of the new travellers and had wandered around among them, but learnt that there were National Council of Civil Liberty Observers at Stonehenge for the events. It was pretty hairy in those days, very silly behaviour by some people and logical behaviour by others. And I met up with the Reverend David Penny, who was a minister for the Church of England at one of the churches in Salisbury. And he had been doing a lot of work among travellers and actually taking them home sometimes to get them a bath and a clean up if they were ill. He married travellers at Stonehenge that wanted to be married among the stones. And he was the most nice person I've ever met. So he was a Liberty Observer as well. And I went up with, she lives down somewhere in St. Burberg's. I've forgotten her name. I apologise, I'm old. And she and I drove around and we rescued one of the people at the Stonehenge that's had shoe trouble, and also I think he was a bit frightened about what was happening, and we took them out of the middle ring where all the action was taking place and put him down on a road so that he could get back home. David Penny was there and various leaders from other parts of the country of traveller community. And we worked out that they were taking these ones they were arresting to a police station on the edge in the more rural part of. So we just rang up a few solicitors and said there were people in there, and they said, well, we'll have to wait for them to start ringing us. But we knew that all the people that were trying to have their festival at Stonehenge that seemed to be written off by the establishment, all had contact telephone numbers of solicitors with them. But David Penny, and I am trying to remember who it was. We had a solicitor and we knew that there was going to be a new government white paper come out after an August issued by the Tories. And we decided, having met barristers, top barristers in London, whose names I've also forgotten, but they appear occasionally in the papers. So I was with the great and the good, definitely. Anyway, we agreed with them that the three of us will sit down, we will compile an act to Parliament that we'd like to see, and that we will send it to them by the beginning of July. Actually, it went in by the end of July because we were all drowning in work. And we sent it up to the barristers in London, sat back and thought, well, we've done our best. This is the legislation to get good behaviour on both sides. It was balanced. It wasn't actually warped just to protect people that wanted to break the law. And when it was published, it was almost word for word. And I said, all those civil servants had gone away for holiday for August and they hadn't done the job they should have done. And we did it for them. And with a little bit of tinkering, that went through. And as we'd had the Criminal Justice Act before, I wrote a report for Shelter, might have a copy of it now, about the Criminal Justice Acts, which was called You Pass the Law, Now What About the People? And that was wandering around amongst some of the local MPs in Bristol, because they knew that we cared. We made sure they saw it. I'm wandering a bit, and I know that. I was seconded to work for the European government, as you know. I went to a meeting in Brussels, in a room full of gypsy representatives from all over Europe, mostly men. I was a lone woman up there. I produced a report on what was happening, and I have actually got a copy of that somewhere in this house, which pointed out that at Vinegar, which is in North Somerset, I think, or Baines, isn't it? It's just over the border of Bath, isn't it? Anyway, what happened there was the Criminal Justice Act said if you were over 12 vehicles on site, they could go in straight away and evict you. And they weren't, they were 11. And the site felt they were safe. And a woman started to give birth to a baby in a van. A midwife went on with her car, and that made it 12 vehicles. The midwife didn't know, and she delivered this baby. The rest of the whole site had been evicted. And there was this one van with one midwife's car on site, and that couple had to go and find out where the rest of their community had got to afterwards. This is not the way human beings should be treating other human beings. And that report went to Brussels, to the European government. I don't think most people knew what I was up to. I was working with some very clever people. ARC had an old disused mining area down also in Somerset, just over the border. And I went, or perhaps I ought to back a bit. Where are we? Why can't I remember her name? She was lovely. Yeah. Anyway, no, right. We used to have a system of giving people that were homeless food in Bristol. And at Christmas, I used to go down to it, and Meg, I think her name was Meg Grimes, could be Meg Grimes. It was an organization to give food to homeless people. And she used to let me have some food. She used to give me socks for the men and clothes and blankets. And she did that for a number of years until somebody in her organization told her she wasn't to give anything else to me anymore, because I was helping travelers and they weren't people that you helped. But I was taking these things on site, and I remember the ARC one. I nearly cried. I was standing there giving out socks to the men that had frostbite, and by the side of me, a little body appeared, and it was a little child. And he said, "Can I have one of the blankets, please?" So I gave him a blanket, and he went away. And then he came back. "Please, can my brother have one as well?" And I thought, sod it. All those people got lots of food at Christmas, living in warm homes, well-dressed, well-shod, and I've got a barefooted child asking me for a blanket as present. It just didn't seem the way we human beings should be treating anyone, no matter what colour, race or creed they were. And the men on that site were absolutely delighted to get the odd bits of things that I had, and I was giving them some food. And I went into a site in Bath as well, and I was giving food there. And the guy said, "I haven't eaten for 3 days." And I was giving him food, mince pies. And I thought, I really don't think this is the right food for you at Christmas. It might be Christmas, but your stomach shouldn't be having this. But it's all I've got to give you. And I'm always grateful for Meg Grimes. Please, anyone that knows anything about family, say, "Jenny says thank you." Because I really was taking it to people that desperately needed it. And that ARC actually ended up in the High Court and was contested by Brian Cox. I sat in front of them, listening to the case, and they were all behind me, and I had to keep them quiet. They don't make a lot of noise. And he fought and gained more time for them so that they could get their vehicles repaired before moving on. It's not the solution, but it was all the temporary things that some of us had to try to achieve. By the way, Avon, the area that Avon covered no longer has a health visitor for travellers and gypsies that go through. Lots of the amenities that we had have disappeared. We know that because I was a county councillor, the city councillor, I know that education was supposed to have records that were passing on from school to school to school to keep the travellers in education. Oh, that's gone. That no longer exists. You want me to stop? There's a little more. I have a feeling you're going to have me back again if you want to, but I get so upset. The logic is, it's so simple. You give them somewhere to stop, you find out what's going on, and then you try to sort out and make it a better life for the innocent people that are among some pretty tough people.
Look forward to hearing more about that on another Friday morning, Jenny. Really rich information. Lovely, thank you.
Yeah.
Ray, you?
Was there very much you say about different groups? Was there kind of the interfamilial type of things, or was it you stayed with your own group, or was it kind of did some groups marry off to other groups and this type of connectivity?
Oh, that was quite interesting, because out on this site that was Eastville, the place where we've got the supermarkets out at Easton and Eastville, that was dead land where bombs have fallen during the war. And it started to mix. And we actually had New Age travelers fancying gypsy girls and vice versa starting to happen, which in a way was a good thing because one could read and write. And so they were making sure the next generation of Summit, it was beginning to actually get them educated. Yeah, I had a traveller woman out there that lost when they got evicted, she couldn't find them. And she came to me for help. And I met her a few weeks later and said, it's all right. I went to the laundrette and they brought the washing in. So I was able to find my family again.
I was wondering, when you were talking about the fairground gypsies, were there, noticeable differences in the way they lived, apart from the fact they had the fairground? I wonder if it affected the rest of the way they ran their lives. Or...
Yeah, yes, they can. If they're putting up a fair, they seem to be able to have a license to be able to stay for a certain amount of time.
Any more questions?
Did it bring back memories to you, Graham?
No, I knew that you were involved and that there was a great need for permanent, well-managed sites, but I never got directly involved in it.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, there's a lot of them living in Southmead now. Yeah.
Well, I think we have come to an end now. So once again, it has been an education journey. To be to listen to you and hear about that what you have been saying. And something that surprised me was you said, I went to the European Union, as you know. No, I didn't. But then again, I learn new things every day.
Yeah.
So thank you for your very interesting talk. Next week, we have the wife of Graham, Valerie, who will be speaking on the Labour Party and why she has been a member for 50 years. So have I, but I am sure Valerie is much more interesting than I. Thank you, friends.